Beans.
How do Romeo and Juliet and its later representation, West Side Story, each reflect on the society and culture of their times? Today I'll be examining how the play Romeo and Juliet and the later representation, the movie West Side Story, explores the themes of intolerance, sexism, and the connection between masculinity and violence. Everyone knows the plot. Girl meets boy, their families hate each other. Their love is doomed from the start. They are star-crossed lovers. One of the positives is that their deaths cause everyone to realize that the feuding has to stop. Romeo and Juliet is staged in the end of the 16th century in England. Conflict, violence, and death are things that happen to everyone every day in that time. Elizabeth I was the queen. Her father, King Henry VIII, had either killed or divorced his wives for not having him a son. He rejected the Catholic religion because it did not let him get divorced, so he created a new one, the Church of England. And he arranged for Catholics to be killed. Even Queen Elizabeth had her own Catholic cousin, Mary Stuart, murdered. In the Elizabethan era, England was a patriarchal society. Even with a queen as the supreme ruler, it was common for girls to have marriages arranged for them by their family and to be treated as property of their father, then their husbands. Marriages were for political reasons, not for love. Lady Capulet says to her daughter Juliet that marrying Paris would be a good idea for Juliet, that it would share all he doth possess, by having him make yourself no less. Romeo is not suitable at all because the Montague family, which Romeo is a part of, were sworn enemies of the Capulets. So young women like Juliet were expected to get married to someone that their family picked out for them, or at least someone they approved of. Young men were expected to fight to show they were honourable. Fighting was considered to be noble and manly. A man would demonstrate his honour by challenging someone to a duel. Male aggression is common in Romeo and Juliet. This reflects the society they lived in at the time. For no reason, Samson, a Capulet servant, bites his thumb at Abraham, a Montague servant, to insult him. This starts a street brawl. A real man is considered tough. When Mercutio is fatally stabbed by Tybalt, he brushes it off as a scratch. Elizabethan society was extremely violent. Using animals to fight each other to the death was a common pastime. Bear baiting involved a bear being tied up and tortured for the audience's amusement. Public hangings were common and people would go watch others be put to death again for amusement. The sexism of male characters reflected what was considered normal in Elizabethan times. The play begins with two Capulet servants, Samson and Gregory, who are joking about sexual violence. What may seem jarring for a modern audience was no doubt accepted as jokes in Shakespeare's time, when women were second-class citizens. Even though Shakespeare depicted for his audience the violence, sexism and hate were their everyday experiences. It seems he wanted them to question this. He used characters such as Romeo and Juliet to challenge gender stereotypes. Romeo is a romantic. His friends make fun of him because he isn't macho, and he talks about his feelings. When Mercutio says Romeo is already dead because he's in love. When Romeo doesn't react angrily to Tybalt, their enemy, Mercutio calls this vile submission. Juliet's nurse says Romeo is as gentle as a lamb. Juliet is a character who also challenges the values about women being submissive. Her language is very direct. When she first meets Romeo, they use puns to talk about kissing. She is not passive. She tells Romeo that if he stays honourable and intends to marry her, he must send word to her and make arrangements. They marry in secret because their families hate each other. Juliet takes poison to pretend to be dead, so she can run away with Romeo. The plan goes wrong because of a mix-up. No one tells Romeo of the plan in time. He finds her thinking she is really dead, he kills himself, and then Juliet wakes up, taking her own life. The play ends with Lord Capulet and Lord Montague ending their feud. Capulet says Romeo and Juliet have been poor sacrifices of our amenity. Now turning to West Side Story, this film is a reflection of the American society at the time, full of conflict, hypermasculinity, racism, and intolerance. This movie was released in 1961. Like Romeo and Juliet, it's a story of a doomed romance. The leads, Maria and Tony, whose stories end tragically when Tony is shot. It is set in New York in the 1950s when there are two gangs that hate each other, the Jets and the Sharks. Tony is the former leader of the Jets, and Maria's brother is the leader of the Sharks, who are the kids of immigrants from Puerto Rico. The political and social context of the time is that America had a huge number of immigrants after World War II ended in 1945. New York City was overcrowded and violent. It was called a melting pot because all the different cultures and races were living in one place, but there was a lot of gang violence. Immigrants were trying to find new identities as Americans. In the 50s and early 60s in America, there was a distinction between the roles of men and women and the pressure to conform. This is reflected in the popular culture of the times. Men and women were portrayed as stereotypes. The advertising industry was taking off. Ads show men going out to work, drinking, buying gadgets for their little woman back at home who is just a housewife and a mother. Advertising reinforced gender stereotypes of the hunter-gatherer man and the submissive woman who existed to cook and clean for her husband. Tony and Maria, as the doomed lovers, challenged gender stereotypes of the time in the same way Romeo and Juliet did. Tony was different to the hypermasculinity that was normal at the time. America had helped win World War II and popular culture. Fighters and macho men were everywhere. Actors like John Wayne portraying tough guys in movies where cowboys fought with the Indians were like heroes and role models. In contrast, this macho culture, Tony is gentle and kind, just like Romeo, described as a gentle lamb. He has left the Jets and treats Maria respectfully, not like the way the other boys do, as they treat women as if they were objects. Tony is not afraid of showing his emotions. He tells Doc that for his love of Maria, he feels like taking a trip to the moon. He is loyal to Ruth but needs to be a part of the gang. Tony tries to stop a rumble because it is important to Maria. However, this is a downfall as he ends up killing Bernardo in revenge of Bernardo killing Ruth. The way Tony and Maria dance is equals. The red imagery is used to reflect passion and sex, shown by the belt Maria wears to the dance when she meets Tony. It also foreshadows the violence and bloodshed. It is no coincidence Maria wears red in the final scenes when she accuses the gangs of hatred and being responsible for Tony's death. Maria is not passive, as women were portrayed in the 50s and 60s in popular culture. She thinks her brother is overprotective of her and calls him a silly watchdog. She sings I Feel Pretty, which is all about her sexuality, which is something she is not ashamed of. Another non-conforming character is Anybody's, who's a trans character rejected as a possible gang member for the Jets, due to not being a boy. Anybody's can't fit in anywhere in a society where you either have to be clearly a male or a female. Male aggression in the film was a reflection on the politics at the time. The Cold War between the USA and the Soviet Union is all about the macho power plays. It started just after World War II ended. Even though the USA and Russia were still on the same side and beating Germany, Americans did not trust the Russian communists. They were like feuding families throughout the 1950s. Both countries built up atomic weapons so they could start a space race to see which country could put men on the moon first. It is ironic that Tony likens being in love, taking a trip to the moon, whereas in the Cold War, the moon was seen as a prize for the macho game. Conflict with the other countries was ingrained in American society. America was involved in the Vietnam War because they wanted to defeat the communist North Vietnam. There was also conflict internally with the beginning of the civil rights movement opposing racism. In West Side Story, the fighting is between two gangs. They call each other names and fight on the street. The owner of a milk bar they hang out at, Doc, asks, fighting over a little piece of street is so important? A Jets gang member, Action, says, to us it is. Just like the Montagues and Capulets, you cannot remember why they are fighting. The head of the Sharks and Maria's brother Bernardo says to the Jets, every one of you hates every one of us, and we hate you right back. There seems to be no reason for any of the fighting. In both Romeo and Juliet and West Side Story, young people suffer because of the older generation's bigotry and intolerance. Those values have been passed on down to their kids. In West Side Story, Doc accuses the Jets of being hoodlums. He asks, when do you kids stop making this world lousy? And then Action responds, we didn't make it, Doc. Both representations of the same love story showed contemporary audiences of the danger of intolerance, racism, and sexism in their societies. In America, not long after the film came out, young people started to change those values. Their music, clothing, hairstyles, and behavior show that they've rejected values of intolerance, gender conformity, racism, and violence. Switching it up to my research methodologies, first I studied the core texts. I was familiar with Romeo and Juliet, so I quickly reread it. I looked at options on which story I could do to represent the different society and contexts. There was a lot to choose from. Some were straight adaptations from the film about gnomes, and some were even films about zombies. I chose West Side Story because I'd not seen it before, and I'm quite interested in the period after World War II and what happened with the mass migrations in Australia and America. I read dozens of articles about American society in the late 50s and early 60s and gangland culture. I read articles about sexism in advertising in the 50s. I looked up historical descriptions of what happened in the Elizabethan society and what was it like to be Romeo and Juliet at the time, in the stage and in the play, to imagine the message that Shakespeare could have been trying to convey to his audiences. I learned that these stories examined similar universal key themes and identities. Even though there were almost 400 years between them, they're still quite similar. The same story of a doomed romance killed by hate used language and imagery and the audience's own experiences to examine values in two different societies. This made me realize that some issues, such as gender politics and intolerance of difference, may always be with us in some way regardless. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you all enjoyed. Have a good weekend. Yeah, see you later. Where he is, but it's alright. Whoa! 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 My internet! Whoa! How much ping do I have? Check my ping, check my ping.